The wind whistled through the ancient pines of Whispering Pines Ranch, carrying the scent of damp earth and wildflowers. Silas Merrick stood on the weathered porch of his log cabin, gnarled fingers clutching a coffee mug that had long since gone cold. His eyes, faded blue but still sharp, gazed at the imposing peaks of Eagle Ridge with a familiar longing. At 72, Silas carried on his slightly stooped shoulders the weight of a lifetime dedicated to this land. The wrinkles etching his face were like detailed maps of the trails he'd traversed for decades. Each line told a story. Each scar held a memory. The ranch, with its worn wooden fences and empty stables, seemed to echo the silence that dominated his existence. The first light of morning illuminated the main stable, now empty except for tools and hay bales. It had been 8 years since Thunder, his golden palomino, had departed this world. The horse had been more than a companion. He'd been a confidant, a friend who'd accompanied him for 25 years. The loss still ached like a thorn lodged deep in his heart. "You promised me you wouldn't do this again." Martha's voice, his late wife, seemed to echo in his memory as he stared at the stable. After losing Thunder, he'd sworn never to become attached to another horse. The pain was too much, like losing a piece of himself. Thunder's hoofbeats still seemed to resonate on the cabin floors on quiet nights. Silas had never allowed another animal to occupy that space in his heart. He kept the ranch running with the bare minimum, caring only for his small herd of cattle and the crops that ensured his livelihood. Setting the mug on the porch railing, Silas adjusted his worn hat over his gray hair and grabbed his oak walking stick, not because he needed it to walk, but because Martha had carved it for him years ago. It was more of a talisman than a necessity. "Good day for a walk," he muttered to himself, descending the porch steps with the familiarity of someone who knows every loose board. The path to Eagle Ridge was steep and demanded effort from his worn knees, but Silas walked it religiously 3 times a week. His connection to these mountains was vital, as if the very air there was different, purer, more alive. As he climbed, he noticed fresh tracks on the trail, wild horses. An involuntary smile formed on his lips. There was something magical about those free animals, running across the slopes like untamed spirits. Sometimes he felt a pang of envy for that freedom, that uncomplicated existence guided only by instinct and the call of the mountains. Upon reaching the ridge, Silas paused to catch his breath. The view from there was breathtaking, a vast valley covered by a blanket of pine trees, cut by a silver river that snaked like a shining ribbon under the morning sun. In the distance, other mountains rose, majestic, touching the infinitely blue sky. That's when he saw them, a herd of wild horses grazing peacefully on the plateau below. Silas counted 12 animals, some adults, others younger. They moved with a natural grace, manes dancing in the wind. Among them, an imposing black mare stood out, clearly the leader of the group. Her proud posture and vigilant gaze revealed impressive strength and intelligence. "Celine," whispered Silas, naming her instantly. But it was another animal that captured his complete attention, a young golden colt, almost the same shade Thunder had been. The animal couldn't have been more than a year old and displayed infinite curiosity, moving slightly away from the group to explore tufts of grass and wildflowers. "Careful, little one," Silas murmured, smiling at the carefree play of the colt. The animal suddenly raised its head as if it had heard. Its eyes, a vibrant brown, seemed to fix exactly where Silas stood. For a fleeting moment, man and horse observed each other, separated by distance but connected by something indefinable. Silas felt something stir in his chest, an emotion long dormant. There was a special quality to that golden colt, something that reminded him not only of Thunder, but of a part of himself he'd thought lost. "Zephyr," he said softly, the name coming naturally to his lips. "Your name is Zephyr." The colt shook his mane as if agreeing, and turned his attention to a particularly tempting tuft of green grass growing dangerously close to the edge of the plateau. That's when time seemed to slow down. Zephyr took a step forward, stretching to reach the grass. Silas noticed the danger a second before it happened. The loose earth, the treacherous slope, the distraction of the young animal. "No!" he shouted, his body instinctively lurching forward. But it was too late. The ground gave way beneath the colt's front hooves. The animal's eyes widened in panic, a sharp whinny cutting through the tranquil morning air. In an instant, Zephyr disappeared from view, followed by the disturbing sound of rolling stones and crumbling earth. Silas's heart stopped, then it violently accelerated, pumping adrenaline through his aged veins. There was a moment of absolute silence, a vacuum in time where everything seemed suspended. Then another whinny echoed, weaker, frightened, but unmistakably alive. The sound of the panicked whinny broke the mountain silence like shattered glass, sending a wave of shivers down Silas's spine. Every fiber of his body screamed for him to move, while his eyes frantically searched for any sign of the fallen colt. The herd reacted instantly. The black mare Celine advanced to the edge of the cliff, her anguished whinnies responding to her foal's calls. "He's alive," Silas murmured to himself, hurrying as fast as his legs allowed toward the accident site. Reaching the edge of the precipice, he carefully lay on his stomach and looked down. His heart nearly escaped through his throat. About 40 feet below, Zephyr had landed on a small ledge on the rocky slope, a miracle in itself considering the dizzying fall that continued for at least another 100 feet to the bottom of the ravine. The young colt was lying down, his legs struggling uselessly against the narrow surface, his eyes wide with primal terror. A trickle of blood ran from a cut above Zephyr's right eye, his golden coat now covered with dust and scratches. But what really worried Silas was the precarious position. The ledge wasn't very wide, and any sudden movement could send the animal into a second fall, this time with no chance of survival. Above him, Selene continued to call, nervously pawing the ground. The other horses in the herd maintained a respectful distance, but remained alert, their occasional whinnies sounding like distant laments. Silas turned to look Selene in the eyes. "I'm going to help him," he promised aloud, knowing that somehow the mare understood the gravity of the situation. A sudden memory flashed through his mind like lightning. Thunder, trapped in a muddy bog during a violent storm 8 years ago. Silas had ridden to town seeking help, but when he returned it was too late. The image of his beloved horse, struggling until his last breath, still haunted him. That feeling of helplessness, of complete failure. "Not this time," he swore to himself, his voice carrying an iron determination. "This time will be different." Without thinking twice, Silas got up and began running back to the ranch. Each step sent sharp pains through his knees, but he ignored them. His mind was already calculating what he would need: ropes, an improvised harness, perhaps a safety hook. Years of working alone in these mountains had taught him to be resourceful. The ranch had never seemed so distant. When he finally reached the cabin, his lungs were burning and sweat was streaming down his face, despite the cold mountain air. He burst into the barn, desperately searching for equipment. His trembling hands located a sturdy rope, the same one he'd used to tow a stuck tractor the previous year. It was heavy, but it would have to do. From an old chest, he retrieved an old climbing harness, a relic from his youth when he explored caves in the mountains. It looked fragile now, the leather cracked by time, but it still maintained its structural integrity. A metal hook with a lock completed the improvised set. "It'll have to be enough," he muttered, gathering everything into a heavy bundle. As he left the barn, he paused briefly on the porch. Martha's portrait on the wall seemed to watch him with that serene smile she always carried. "I know what you'd say," he spoke to the image, "that I'm too old for heroics." A tired smile crossed his lips. "But you'd also say that I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try." The return journey was a battle against time and his own physical limitations. The heavy rope slipped from his shoulder and the harness banged against his back with each hurried step. When he finally returned to the site of the fall, Selene was still there, her dark eyes now fixed on Silas, following his every movement. Zephyr had stopped struggling, but his frightened eyes moved frantically, and his breathing came in quick, shallow puffs. The rocky ledge had begun to give way at one of the edges. Small stones were breaking loose, falling silently into the abyss below. Tying one end of the rope to a sturdy pine tree, Silas tested its firmness several times. There was no room for errors. His own heartbeat seemed deafening in his ears as he adjusted the harness around his body. It was now or never. With one last look at Selene, he began his descent. Each movement was careful, each step calculated. The rocky surface was treacherous, damp in some spots, fragile in others. Halfway down, his foot slipped on a loose stone, and for a terrible second he dangled in emptiness, supported only by the rope and harness. A groan escaped his dry lips as he forced himself to regain control. "You can do it, old man," he murmured to himself. "Now's not the time to give up," he continued, ignoring his body's protests. The proximity to the precipice, the cutting wind on his face, the tension of the rope, all of this brought back memories of a previous life, when climbing was a regular part of his existence, before the responsibility of the ranch and family occupied all his time. After what seemed like an eternity, he reached the ledge where Zephyr was trapped. The space was even smaller than he had estimated, barely accommodating the colt. Silas would need to balance precariously while he worked. "Hey boy," he called softly, trying to calm the frightened animal. "I'm here to help." Zephyr's dark eyes finally focused on him, the terror giving way to something like curiosity. Despite the desperate situation, Silas couldn't help but notice the intelligence that shone in that gaze. There was an understanding there, as if the cult recognized that this human represented his only chance. "That's right, boy. We're going to get out of here together." The rocky ledge trembled under the combined weight of Silas and Zephyr, sending a small cascade of stones into the abyss below. The colt whinnied nervously, his wide eyes reflecting a primal terror. The fall had left its marks. Besides the cut above his eye, Silas noticed that the right front leg was slightly swollen. It didn't seem broken, but certainly injured. "Easy, boy, easy," Silas murmured, keeping his voice deliberately low and steady. Years of experience with horses had taught him that tone of voice was as important as the words themselves. "I need you to trust me now." As he spoke, his hands worked with the rope, creating an improvised system that could support the animal's weight during the ascent. Each movement was measured, precise, despite fingers trembling from effort and age. There was no room for errors here. A poorly tied knot, a loose binding, and all would be lost. The rock beneath them released another piece, leaving the platform even smaller. Silas felt a drop of cold sweat trickle down his temple as he accelerated his movements, now with renewed urgency. "Come on, boy! We need to be quick!" Above them, Celine's anguished whinny echoed across the mountainside. Her calls seemed to say, "Hurry, human! Hurry!" Silas finally finished adapting the harness and rope for the colt. It was improvised work, but it would have to function. With infinite care, he began to adjust the equipment around Zephyr's chest and flanks. The animal shuddered at the touch, but didn't try to flee, as if instinctively understanding that this stranger with gentle hands was his only hope. That's it, good boy," Silas murmured. "You're brave, aren't you? A true son of the mountains." When the improvised harness was finally positioned, Silas took a step back, or as far back as the small platform allowed, and admired his work. It wasn't perfect, but it would support the animal during the ascent. It was then that he realized the fundamental problem. How could he lift a colt that must weigh at least 300 pounds? His old hands, though still strong for his age, wouldn't have the necessary strength to hoist the animal alone. He needed some kind of pulley system, something that would multiply his strength, but he had nothing like that at hand. "Think, old man," he muttered to himself. "Think." His eyes scanned the rock face, seeking inspiration. That's when he noticed a natural protrusion in the rock, about 6 feet above his current position. If he could thread the rope through there, he would create a natural support point that would give him a mechanical advantage. "Perfect," he whispered, feeling a spark of hope ignite in his chest. Carefully, Silas began to climb again, this time just enough to reach the rocky formation. His muscles protested violently, and for a terrible moment, he felt fatigue threaten to overcome him. But the sight of the frightened colt below renewed his strength. With a precise movement, he passed the rope through the rocky protrusion, creating an improvised system that would allow him to use his body weight as a counterweight to lift Zephyr. Descending again to the colt, Silas checked all the bindings one last time. Satisfied, he positioned himself to apply maximum force when lifting the animal. "Let's go, boy. The time has come." With a deep sigh, Silas began to pull. At first, nothing happened. The rope stretched, tensing almost to the breaking point, but Zephyr remained motionless. Sweat ran down Silas's face, his veins bulging beneath wrinkled skin with the immense effort. Come on," he grunted, feeling every muscle in his body protest. Then, gradually, the colt began to rise. Centimeter by centimeter, inch by inch, Zephyr was being lifted from the rocky ledge. The animal whinnied in confusion, his legs agitating in the air, but the harness held firm. Up above, Celine watched everything with attentive eyes, her whinnies now seeming like encouragements. The pain in Silas's arms was almost unbearable. His muscles burned as if they were on fire. His joints seemed about to dislocate, but there was something stronger than pain driving him, a fierce determination, a silent promise made years ago in the face of Thunder's loss. "Not giving up," he gasped, each word punctuated by a pull on the rope. A flash of memory crossed his mind. Martha sitting on the porch watching him train Thunder years ago. "You have a gift, Silas," she had said. "These animals trust you, like they trust the very ground beneath their hooves." The memory brought new strength. With a cry that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, Silas gave one last, powerful pull. Zephyr rose a few more crucial centimeters, reaching the point where his front legs finally found support at the edge of the precipice. The colt, sensing solid ground, used his own strength to complete the climb, propelling himself upward and away from the edge with a fluid movement that drew a sigh of relief from Silas. Zephyr was safe. The moment the colt reached secure ground, Celine advanced, surrounding him with intense maternal care. Her muzzle traversed every inch of her foal's body, checking for injuries, ensuring he was truly well. Silas, still hanging on the slope, observed the scene with an exhausted smile. His work wasn't finished. He still needed to climb back, but for a moment he allowed himself to simply admire the bond between the mare and her colt. It was something primordial, sacred in a way. Gathering his last reserves of strength, he began to climb. Each movement was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. His fingers, bruised and bleeding in some spots, clung to the rocks with iron determination. The wind had increased, making the climb even more challenging. When he finally reached the edge of the precipice, Silas was at the limit of his strength. He rolled onto the safety of flat ground, panting, each breath burning in his overworked lungs. For a long moment he lay there, unable to do more than breathe. When he finally managed to sit up, he realized he wasn't alone. Celine and Zephyr remained there, a few yards away. The rest of the herd had retreated to a safe distance, but mother and son stayed close, watching him with what could only be described as intense curiosity. Slowly, cautiously, Selene took a step in his direction, her dark eyes deep as the mountain night fixed on his. There was something in that gaze, not just animal instinct, but an awareness, an understanding. For an eternal moment, human and mare evaluated each other. Then Celine lowered her imposing head in a gesture that seemed almost like a reverence. Zephyr, imitating his mother, did the same. Silas felt his heart skip a beat. In all his years in the mountains, he had never witnessed such behavior from a wild horse. "You're welcome," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. As if she had perfectly understood, Celine raised her head again. With one last, prolonged look, she turned and guided Zephyr back to join the herd. Soon the wild horses disappeared among the trees, leaving only the sound of distant hooves as proof of their existence. Silas remained seated, observing the place where they had disappeared, a serene smile on his tired lips. Something important had happened there, something that transcended words and rational explanations. A bond had been formed, and somehow Silas knew this wouldn't be his last encounter with Celine and Zephyr. 3 months passed since the rescue on the mountainside. Summer gave way to autumn, painting Eagle Ridge with ardent tones of red, orange, and gold. The nights grew longer, and cold winds began to descend from the higher mountains, announcing the approaching winter. During this period, Silas returned several times to the rescue site, a part of him hoping to spot Celine and Zephyr again. Occasionally, he found fresh tracks or other signs of the herd, but the horses themselves remained elusive, like mountain ghosts. News of the rescue spread throughout the small valley community. The few distant neighbors Silas had began to look at him with renewed respect. The old recluse of the mountain had transformed into a kind of local hero, a role that made him deeply uncomfortable. "I didn't do anything that anyone wouldn't do," he always responded when someone mentioned the deed. But he knew, deep down, that it wasn't true. Few would have risked so much for a wild animal. On a particularly cold October afternoon, Silas noticed dark clouds accumulating around the highest peaks. His right knee ached, a natural barometer that rarely erred. "Storm coming," he muttered to himself, observing the sky from the porch. Despite the implicit warning in his body, Silas decided to take one last walk before the rain arrived. There was something unsettling in the air, an electricity that seemed to call to him. He grabbed his heaviest jacket, a flashlight as a precaution, and his carved walking stick. The path to Eagle Ridge seemed different that afternoon, darker, almost threatening under the heavy sky. The forest was silent, animals already seeking shelter against the imminent storm. Only the wind spoke, whispering among the trees like an ancient warning song. Maybe this wasn't the best idea, he acknowledged to himself, but continued climbing. Upon reaching the top of the ridge, the normally spectacular view was obscured by a curtain of mist and low clouds. The temperature had dropped drastically, and the first drops of rain began to fall, thick and icy, promising a substantial storm. Silas decided to return. He turned around, leaning heavily on his walking stick. That's when he heard it, distant, almost muffled by the growing rain. A familiar whinny. He stopped, tilting his head to listen better. There it was again, the unmistakable call of Celine. "Where are you, girl?" he murmured, looking around. Visibility diminished by the minute as the rain intensified. Following the sound, Silas moved away from the main trail, entering a rockier and more unstable area. The rain now fell in torrents, transforming the soil into a slippery trap. His jacket was already soaked, water running down his wrinkled face and blurring his vision. That's when he spotted movement. About 50 yards ahead, a dark form moving agitatedly on the mountainside. The mist opened momentarily, and Silas saw Selene. The mare seemed agitated, moving back and forth, anguished whinnies cutting through the storm. "What is it, girl?" shouted Silas, but his voice was swallowed by the storm's roar. He approached closer, struggling against the wind and rain. The mud pulled at his boots with each step, and his walking stick sank dangerously into the soaked ground. A few yards from Selene, he finally understood the cause of her distress. Part of the trail had collapsed, creating a treacherous depression where Zephyr was trapped. The young colt, now visibly larger than 3 months ago, struggled in mud up to his belly, unable to find support to get out. "Easy, boy," Silas shouted, cautiously approaching the edge of the mud pit. The scene awakened painful memories. Thunder, trapped in a similar way years ago. The helplessness he had felt then threatened to overwhelm him again, but Silas pushed it away with iron determination. Not today. Not again. Quickly assessing the situation, he realized he would need to reach Zephyr. The colt was exhausted, his efforts to free himself only sinking him deeper into the mass of earth and water. His eyes showed pure terror, amplified by the occasional lightning that illuminated the stormy sky. Selene retreated a bit when Silas approached closer, but didn't flee. Her eyes alternated between the human and her foal in danger, as if begging for help. "I'll get him out," Silas promised, "but I need you to trust me." As if she understood, the mare quieted, watching attentively. Silas cautiously tested the edge of the mud pit with his walking stick. He needed to find a safe path to Zephyr, without getting stuck himself. Step by step, using the stick to probe the ground ahead, he advanced toward the colt. The sticky mud soon reached his knees, making each movement a battle. The merciless rain reduced visibility to a few yards, and the howling wind muffled his calls to calm Zephyr. When he finally reached the colt, Silas was breathless and shaking from cold. Zephyr initially recoiled, frightened, but something in the human's smell or presence seemed to calm him. Perhaps a memory of the previous rescue. "That's it, boy. It's me. I'm here to help again." Carefully, Silas positioned himself beside the colt. He needed to create some kind of stable surface for Zephyr to support himself and get out. Looking around, he noticed some fallen branches nearby. Stretching to his maximum reach, he managed to grab them and drag them close. Working methodically despite the cold and fatigue, he created a kind of improvised mat beneath Zephyr's hooves, gradually building a foundation firm enough for the animal to gain leverage. "Now, boy, you need to push," Silas encouraged, his voice barely audible over the storm. As if understanding the command, Zephyr gathered his remaining strength. With a powerful thrust, he managed to push his front legs onto the firmer ground Silas had created. The colt's eyes brightened with renewed hope. "That's it! Keep going!" Inch by inch, Zephyr fought his way out of the mud trap. Silas pushed and pulled, ignoring the stabbing pains in his back and the numbing cold in his extremities. Finally, with one last supreme effort, the colt broke free, scrambling onto solid ground. Selene immediately rushed to her son, her body positioning protectively between him and the mud pit. Her eyes, however, remained fixed on Silas, who was now struggling to free himself from the sticky morass. The effort to save Zephyr had depleted what little strength Silas had left. Each attempt to pull himself free only seemed to sink him deeper. The cold had numbed his limbs, and the unforgiving rain continued to pound against his hunched figure. "Just need a minute," he gasped, trying to catch his breath. It was then that something extraordinary happened. Selene, after ensuring Zephyr was safe, approached the edge of the mud pit. With calculated precision, she extended her neck, offering her mane within Silas's reach. For a moment, Silas could only stare in disbelief. The mare's intelligent eyes seemed to say, "Take it. Now we save you." With trembling hands, Silas grasped the thick black mane. Selene tensed her powerful neck muscles and began to back up slowly, providing the anchor Silas desperately needed. With her help, he managed to pull himself free from the mud's grasp, collapsing onto firmer ground. Exhausted beyond measure, soaked to the bone and covered in mud, Silas lay on his back, rain pelting his face. A weak laugh escaped his lips, a sound of pure wonder and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered to the mare standing over him. The storm continued to rage, but in that moment a strange calm enveloped the three figures on the mountainside. A man and two wild horses, connected by something deeper than words could express. Silas knew he needed to find shelter soon before hypothermia set in. With enormous effort, he pushed himself to his feet. His cabin was at least an hour's walk away, and in his current condition, it might as well have been on another continent. As if sensing his predicament, Selene nudged him gently with her muzzle, then inclined her head toward a dense stand of trees about 100 yards away. She took a few steps in that direction, then looked back at him expectantly. "You want me to follow you?" Silas asked incredulously. The mare nickered softly, taking a few more steps toward the trees. Zephyr followed, occasionally looking back at Silas. "Lead on then," he murmured, stumbling after them. The wild horses guided him to a natural overhang in the rock face, partially sheltered by thick pines. It wasn't completely dry, but it offered significant protection from the worst of the downpour. Silas collapsed gratefully in the makeshift shelter, his back against the cold stone. To his amazement, Selene and Zephyr didn't leave. Instead, they positioned themselves at the opening, their bodies creating an additional windbreak. Their warm presence helped stave off the biting cold that threatened to overwhelm Silas's exhausted body. "Never seen anything like it," he murmured, watching the two wild horses who had chosen to stay with him. As night fell and the storm continued to howl, Silas drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he opened his eyes, the horses remained, silent sentinels against the darkness. In his semi-lucid state, he thought of Martha, of thunder, of all he had lost over the years. But for the first time in a very long while, those memories weren't tinged with only sadness. There was something else there too, a warmth, a connection, a sense that perhaps not everything precious was lost forever. "Reckon we're even now," he whispered to Selene, as his eyes grew heavy once more. "Yet you saved me just like I saved your boy." The mare turned her head, her intelligent eyes finding his in the dim light. And in that gaze, Silas saw something that transcended the barrier between human and animal: recognition, understanding, and perhaps even friendship. As he drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the unlikely guardians, Silas felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The morning after the storm broke crystal clear, the sky washed to a brilliant blue that seemed almost unreal after the previous day's tempest. Silas awoke to find himself alone beneath the rocky overhang, his body stiff and aching, but remarkably alive. Selene and Zephyr were gone, leaving only hoofprints in the mud to prove they had been there at all. "Wasn't a dream then," he murmured, pushing himself to his feet with a grimace. The walk back to his cabin took twice as long as usual. Each step was a negotiation with his protesting muscles, and twice he had to stop to rest. But as he crested the final ridge and saw the weathered timber of Whispering Pines Ranch below, something had changed in the way he viewed his solitary home. Word of Silas's night in the mountains spread quickly through the small community. Lucien Parker, a young rancher from the neighboring property, rode over the following day to check on the old man. "You're telling me wild horses stood guard over you all night?" Lucien asked, his voice thick with disbelief as they sat on Silas's porch, steam rising from mugs of strong coffee. "No offense, Mr. Merrick, but that sounds like something from a storybook." Silas smiled, his weathered face crinkling around the eyes. "Thought the same thing myself, but I know what I saw." "Must have been quite a night," Lucien said, shaking his head. At 32, he represented the new generation of ranchers in the valley, educated, progressive, but lacking the bone-deep connection to the land that men like Silas possessed. "It was more than that," Silas replied quietly, his gaze drifting to the distant mountains. "It was a reminder." "Of what?" "That we're not as separate from the wild as we like to think." The weeks that followed transformed Silas in ways subtle but profound. He found himself rising earlier, working longer, his steps lighter despite the approach of winter. The empty stables, which had stood as monuments to loss for 8 long years, were swept clean, minor repairs tackled with newfound energy. Martha's portrait still watched from the wall, but now Silas found himself talking to her image with excitement rather than sorrow. "You'd have loved to see it, Mar," he'd say, describing again the intelligence in Selene's eyes, the trust shown by her and her colt. December arrived with the first heavy snows. Silas worried about the wild horses, knowing that winter in the mountains could be brutal and food scarce. Against all conventional wisdom, he began to ride out every few days, leaving bales of hay in sheltered spots where he'd seen evidence of the herd. On the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, Silas saddled his old mare Penny and loaded her with 2 fresh hay bales. The temperature had plummeted overnight, and his breath formed thick clouds in the frigid air as they made their slow way up to Eagle Ridge. He was arranging the hay beneath a stand of pines when he heard it, the soft nicker that he'd come to recognize instantly. Turning slowly, his heart thundering in his chest, he found himself face to face with Selene. The black mare stood just 20 feet away, Zephyr close behind her. "Well, hello there," Silas said softly, keeping perfectly still. Selene approached cautiously, nostrils flaring as she assessed him and Penny. The old riding horse stood placidly, seemingly untroubled by the presence of her wild counterpart. With deliberate slowness, Selene came forward until she stood directly before Silas. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other, man and wild horse connected by shared experience and something more profound than either could articulate. Then, with gentle deliberation, Selene extended her muzzle and touched Silas's outstretched hand. The contact lasted only seconds, but it sent an electric current of emotion through Silas's entire being. This wasn't just any touch, it was an acknowledgement, a greeting between equals, perhaps even friends. "It's good to see you too," he whispered, his voice thick. Zephyr, bolder now, approached as well. The young colt had grown significantly in the months since his rescue, his golden coat thickened for winter, his frame promising the power of a stallion to come. The cut above his eye had healed completely, leaving only the faintest line of white hairs to mark where it had been. To Silas's astonishment, Zephyr allowed him to run a hand down his neck, standing perfectly still under the human touch. Penny watched with placid interest as the wild horses accepted Silas's presence. That day marked the beginning of something extraordinary. Though the rest of the herd remained distant and wary, Selene and Zephyr began to appear regularly when Silas made his feed runs. Sometimes they would follow him for a while as he rode Penny back toward the ranch. Other times, they would simply watch from a distance as he distributed hay and mineral blocks. January brought the deepest cold, with temperatures plummeting well below zero. The snow lay thick across Eagle Ridge, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and pristine. During this harshest period, Silas worried constantly about the wild herd, increasing his feed runs to every other day, despite the difficulty of the journey. On one particularly brutal morning, with the wind chill making the air feel like razor blades against exposed skin, Silas found not just Selene and Zephyr waiting at his usual drop spot, but the entire herd. 12 wild horses stood in a loose semicircle, their breath forming clouds of steam in the frigid air. They parted silently to allow him to approach with Penny and his load of hay. "Well, I'll be," Silas murmured, astonished by the sight. "Looks like I've been accepted." The moment carried a weight of significance that made his chest tighten. These proud, free creatures had decided to trust a human, a revolutionary act in their world of instinct and wariness. As he distributed the hay, moving slowly and speaking in a gentle murmur, Silas felt as though he'd been granted entry into an ancient, sacred circle. That night, as he sat before the fireplace in his cabin, a mug of whiskey-laced coffee warming his hands, Silas found himself revisiting memories of thunder. For the first time, the images came without the accompanying stab of pain. Instead, there was a bittersweet warmth, an appreciation for what had been, rather than sorrow for what was lost. "I think I'm finally keeping my promise to you, Martha," he said to the portrait on the wall. "Learning to let go doesn't mean forgetting, just means making room for something new." February arrived with its short, fierce days and long, star-filled nights. Silas continued his feed runs, and with each visit, Selene and Zephyr grew more comfortable in his presence. The young colt, in particular, seemed drawn to the old man, often approaching to sniff his pockets for the apple slices Silas had taken to carrying. "Are you getting spoiled?" Silas chuckled one afternoon, as Zephyr nudged his hand impatiently for treats. "Won't be truly wild much longer if you keep this up." The words, spoken in jest, triggered a moment of reflection. Was he doing these magnificent creatures a disservice by encouraging their comfort around humans? Not everyone who might encounter them would have their best interests at heart. His worried thoughts were interrupted by Lucien Parker, who had taken to occasionally joining him on these mountain excursions. The young rancher's initial skepticism had given way to fascination as he witnessed the unusual bond between Silas and the wild horses. "It's like something out of a legend," Lucien commented, as they watched Zephyr playfully chase snowflakes while Selene grazed on the hay Silas had brought. "Does it ever make you want to try and tame them? Bring them down to the ranch?" Silas shook his head firmly. That's not what this is about. They belong to themselves, to these mountains. Not to me or anyone else. But they trust you, Lucian pressed. Especially that colt. He'd probably follow you home if you asked him to. Trust isn't ownership, Silas replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Greatest gift we can give something we love is the freedom to be exactly what it is. These horses aren't pets or possessions. They're partners, in a way. Lucian considered this, his young face thoughtful beneath his woolen hat. I've never thought of it like that. My whole life, it's been about breaking horses, making them submit. There are other ways, Silas said quietly. Takes longer, requires more patience. But what you get in the end is something far more valuable than submission. The younger man nodded slowly, his gaze following Zephyr's exuberant movements across the snow. I think I'd like to learn more about that way. March brought the first tentative signs of spring, patches of ground emerging from beneath melting snow, the earliest wildflowers pushing through in sheltered spots, birds returning with their dawn chorus. The wild horses began to range more widely as natural forage became available again, and Silas saw them less frequently. It was during this transitional time that Silas received an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Jim Tanner arrived at Whispering Pines one afternoon, his official vehicle looking out of place against the rustic backdrop of the ranch. Got a situation I thought you should know about, Tanner said without preamble, as Silas offered him coffee on the porch. Someone's been up in the hills setting snares. Illegal ones. Silas felt his blood run cold. What kind of snares? Big ones, horse-sized. The sheriff's face was grim. Found 3 already, deactivated them. But there could be more. Poachers? Silas asked, his voice tight. Tanner shrugged. Could be. There's a market for wild horse meat overseas, or could be those Mustang hunters who sell to the rodeo circuits. Either way, it's illegal on protected land. The herd up on Eagle Ridge, exactly why I came to you, Tanner cut in. Word is you've got some kind of connection with those horses. Thought you might be able to keep an eye out, maybe help us locate any more traps before an animal gets hurt. Silas gripped his coffee mug so tightly his knuckles whitened. I'll start today. The news cast a shadow over the tentative joy of spring. Over the next week, Silas spent every daylight hour combing the ridges and valleys of Eagle Ridge, searching for the cruel metal devices that could maim or kill. He found and disabled 4 more, marking their locations on a map for Sheriff Tanner. The wild herd seemed to sense the danger. They moved more cautiously, stayed higher in the mountains, and appeared even more wary of human presence, all except Celine and Zephyr, who still approached Silas when he called to them. It was a crisp morning in late March when Silas heard it, a sound that turned his blood to ice, a horse's scream of pain and terror echoing across the valley. Without hesitation, he kicked Penny into a gallop, heading toward the sound with his heart in his throat. The scene he encountered made him sick with rage. Zephyr, now nearly fully grown, was caught in a vicious snare, the metal wire cutting into his right front leg as he struggled. Blood stained the golden coat, and the young horse's eyes rolled with panic. Nearby, Selena paced frantically, unwilling to leave her son but unable to help. "Easy, boy, easy," Silas called, dismounting quickly and approaching with his hands visible. "I'm here. I'm going to help you." Zephyr's struggles intensified at the human approach, driving the wire deeper into his flesh. Silas's stomach clenched at the sight, but he kept his voice steady and calm. "Celine, help me out here, girl," he murmured, glancing at the mare. "Tell him it's okay." As if understanding his words, Celine approached her struggling son and positioned herself close beside him, her presence seeming to calm him slightly. With the young horse momentarily still, Silas was able to examine the trap more closely. It was a wire snare attached to a spring mechanism, cruel, efficient, and definitely illegal. The wire had cut deeply into Zephyr's leg, and blood flowed freely from the wound. But with enormous relief, Silas could see that it hadn't hit an artery or severed any tendons. With proper care, the leg could heal. First, though, he had to free the horse without causing more damage. From his saddlebag, Silas retrieved wire cutters and heavy gloves. Years of ranch work had taught him to always carry basic tools, a preparation that now might save Zephyr's life. "This is going to hurt, boy," he warned softly. But it's the only way." Working methodically despite the adrenaline coursing through his system, Silas cut through the wire at strategic points, gradually loosening its deadly grip. Zephyr trembled, but remained relatively still, as if understanding that this pain was the path to freedom. When the last strand gave way, the young horse stumbled forward, nearly collapsing. The wound immediately began bleeding more heavily, freed from the pressure of the wire that had both cut and constricted it. Silas quickly retrieved his first aid kit, another rancher's habit, and sprinkled antiseptic powder liberally over the wound. It wasn't ideal, but it might prevent infection long enough for the natural healing process to begin. Zephyr stood shakily, testing his injured leg gingerly. It would support some weight, but he clearly couldn't run or move quickly. In the wilderness, such an injury could be a death sentence, leaving him vulnerable to predators or starvation if he couldn't keep up with the herd. A decision crystallized in Silas's mind. "You need to come with me, boy," he said firmly, "just until you heal. Then you can return to the mountains." The challenge was how to move an injured wild horse down several miles of mountain terrain to the safety of his ranch. Zephyr couldn't walk the distance, and even if Silas could somehow fashion a travois, Penny wasn't strong enough to drag it with a 1,000-pound horse's cargo. As if sensing his dilemma, Selene stepped forward and positioned herself directly beside her injured son, offering support. Silas watched in amazement as Zephyr leaned against his mother, using her strength to compensate for his weakened leg. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. "Looks like we've got a plan." The journey back to Whispering Pines Ranch was painfully slow. Silas led the way on Penny, setting a deliberate pace that Zephyr could manage with Selene's support. Every few hundred yards they stopped to rest, allowing the injured horse to gather his strength. By late afternoon, the unlikely procession reached the ranch. Lucian Parker, who had been helping repair fences, stared in open-mouthed astonishment as Silas led not only Penny, but 2 wild horses into the yard. "Is that—" "Zephyr's hurt," Silas cut him off. "Caught in a poacher's snare. Need to get him into the stable and treat that leg properly." To Silas's surprise, guiding Zephyr into the long, empty main stable proved remarkably straightforward. Whether from pain, exhaustion, or some level of trust, the young horse followed him willingly, with Selene close behind. "What about her?" Lucian asked, nodding toward the black mare as they prepared to clean Zephyr's wound. "She'll bolt first chance she gets." Silas shook his head, watching as Selene positioned herself protectively near her son. "No, she won't leave him. Not while he's hurt." The next few hours were dedicated to treating Zephyr's injury, cleaning the deep laceration, applying proper antiseptic and wound paste, and bandaging it securely. Throughout the process, the young horse remained remarkably calm, occasionally nickering softly to his mother, who stood steadfast nearby. "Never seen anything like it," Lucian commented, as they finally stepped back to observe their handiwork. "Wild horses just don't behave this way around humans." "These aren't just any wild horses," Silas replied, his gaze moving between mother and son. "And I'm not just any human, not to them anyway." As night fell, Silas prepared to leave the stable, expecting to close the doors and effectively contain the wild horses until morning. To his astonishment, Selene followed him to the entrance, her dark eyes holding his in the lantern light. "You're free to go," he told her softly. "I'll take care of him." The mare regarded him for a long moment, then deliberately turned and walked back to her son's side, settling onto the straw beside him. Silas left the stable doors open that night, a gesture of trust and respect. If Selene chose to leave, that was her right, but when he returned at dawn, both horses remained, Zephyr resting comfortably and Selene standing guard. Spring unfurled across Eagle Ridge in a progression of green and gold, the land awakening from its winter slumber. In the main stable of Whispering Pines Ranch, another awakening was taking place. Zephyr's injured leg, professionally treated by the valley's veterinarian and cared for daily by Silas, was healing remarkably well. The deep gash had closed cleanly, and though a scar would always mark the golden coat, the young horse had regained full mobility. Throughout the 4 weeks of recovery, Selene had remained by her son's side, adapting to stable life with a dignity that impressed everyone who witnessed it. She accepted Silas's presence completely, even allowing him to groom her occasionally, a level of trust virtually unheard of in a wild horse without formal training. "Time to let them go," Silas announced one perfect May morning, as he and Lucian stood watching the horses graze in the small paddock adjacent to the stable. The younger man looked surprised. "You're sure? That colt? Sorry, he's practically a stallion now. He's sound enough to survive in the wild. Doc Peterson cleared him last week, said the leg's strong as ever." Silas leaned on the fence, his weathered face contemplative. "Besides, they don't belong here. Never did." "They could, though," Lucian suggested cautiously. "That bond you have with them. You could train them proper. Have yourself a couple of fine riding horses." Silas shook his head firmly. That's not my decision to make. Freedom's theirs by right. Can't take that away just because I've grown fond of having them around. The decision wasn't as simple as Silas made it sound. Over the weeks of Zephyr's convalescence, the old rancher had grown accustomed to the sounds of horses in his stable again, to the morning ritual of feeding and grooming, to the quiet companionship of these intelligent creatures. The empty spaces in his heart, carved by loss and solitude, had begun to fill again. But deeper than his personal desires ran his respect for the wild nature of these animals. They had come to him in need, and he had helped them. To demand more would be to betray the very trust that made their relationship so extraordinary. The day of release dawned clear and warm. Silas rose before sunrise, took extra care with his morning coffee, and walked out to the stable with a mixture of sadness and rightness in his heart. "Morning," he greeted the horses as he entered. Both Selene and Zephyr nickered in response, moving to the stall door expectantly. Over the weeks they had learned that Silas's arrival meant food and attention, comforts to which they had grown accustomed. Today, however, Silas brought no grain or hay. Instead, he simply opened the stall door wide, then stepped back. "You're free to go," he said softly. "Back to your herd, back to the mountains." For a long moment, neither horse moved. They regarded Silas with what seemed like confusion, perhaps even reluctance. Then Selene stepped forward, her head held high, and walked deliberately past him toward the open stable doors. Sunlight caught her black coat, turning it to midnight blue as she emerged into the early morning light. Zephyr hesitated longer, approaching Silas and nudging his chest gently with his muzzle. The gesture, so reminiscent of Thunder's affectionate habits, made Silas's throat tighten with emotion. "Go on, boy," he urged, his voice rough. "Your place is with her, with the herd, where you belong." With one last look that Silas would remember for the rest of his days, Zephyr turned and followed his mother into the sun-drenched yard. Together, the two wild horses crossed the open space, their pace increasing gradually from walk to trot as they approached the property boundary. At the fence line, they paused, looking back toward the man who stood watching them. Silas raised his hand in a silent farewell. Then, as one, Selene and Zephyr leapt the low fence and broke into a gallop, racing toward the distant slopes of Eagle Ridge, their manes and tails streaming like banners in the morning light. "Godspeed," Silas whispered, watching until they disappeared from sight. The weeks that followed were quieter than before, the absence of the horses keenly felt in every corner of the ranch. Yet Silas found himself filled not with the old familiar emptiness, but with a sense of purpose renewed. He threw himself into long-neglected projects, repairing fencing, clearing new trails, even planting a vegetable garden beside the cabin. "You seem different," Lucien commented one afternoon as they worked together setting fence posts. "More, I don't know. Alive, I guess." Silas considered this, driving his shovel into the earth with practiced efficiency. "Reckon I am," he acknowledged. "Funny thing about letting go. Makes room for something new to come along." Summer arrived in a blaze of heat and color. Silas continued his rides up to Eagle Ridge, though now they were simply explorations rather than feed runs. Occasionally he would spot the wild herd in the distance, but Selene and Zephyr, if they were present, gave no sign of recognizing him. He told himself this was as it should be, their return to true wildness a success rather than a disappointment. It was on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, that Silas decided to camp overnight on the ridge. He hadn't spent a night under the stars in many years, and something about the perfect weather and endless twilight called to him. With a simple bedroll, some food, and a small pot for coffee, he made his way to a favorite spot, with a view of both the valley and the higher peaks beyond. As darkness finally fell, hours later than usual at this time of year, Silas built a small fire and settled beside it with a cup of strong coffee. The night was alive with sounds, the soft hooting of owls, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. He sat in peaceful contemplation, grateful for this moment of connection with the wild world. The subtle shift in the night sounds alerted him first, a hushing of the nearby forest, a sense of larger presences approaching. Silas remained still, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle he'd brought as a precaution against mountain lions. But what emerged from the tree line wasn't a predator. Selene stepped into the small clearing, her dark form silhouetted against the starlit sky. Behind her came Zephyr, now grown into the impressive young stallion Silas had always known he would become. The scar on his leg was barely visible in the firelight, a small badge of his survival story. "Well, hello there," Silas said softly, his heart pounding with unexpected joy. "I didn't expect to see you two again." The horses approached cautiously, nostrils flaring as they caught his scent on the breeze. For a moment, Silas feared they might bolt, their wild instincts reasserting themselves after weeks of freedom. But instead, Selene walked directly to where he sat and lowered her proud head to his level. With infinite gentleness, Silas raised his hand and placed it against her warm muzzle. "You remembered," he whispered. Zephyr joined them, his youthful curiosity evident as he investigated Silas's backpack and bedroll. There was no fear in him, no hesitation, only the comfortable familiarity of one friend greeting another after a long absence. For over an hour, the unlikely trio shared the small clearing. Silas remained seated by his fire, occasionally speaking softly to the horses who grazed nearby. No fences separated them, no ropes bound them. Only choice and mutual respect kept them in proximity. As the embers of his fire died down, Silas prepared his bedroll for the night. To his amazement, Selene and Zephyr didn't disappear back into the forest, but settled nearby, the mare standing dozily with one hind hoof cocked in rest, the young stallion actually lying down a few yards from Silas's position. "Keeping watch, are you?" he asked with a smile. "Returning the favor from that stormy night?" Selene nickered softly as if in agreement. Silas slept deeply that night, surrounded by the breathing presence of the horses. When dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, he awoke to find them still there, grazing peacefully in the morning light. "Thank you for the visit," he told them as he packed his simple gear. "For best night's sleep I've had in years." Before departing, Silas stood for a long moment, committing to memory every detail of the scene, the way the rising sun gilded Zephyr's coat, the intelligent depth in Selene's eyes, the perfect wild beauty of these creatures who had chosen, for reasons beyond human understanding, to honor him with their trust. "So I'll be seeing you," he said finally, shouldering his pack. It wasn't a goodbye. It was an acknowledgement of a new reality, that distance and difference need not sever the bonds of genuine connection. As summer gave way to autumn, and autumn prepared to yield once more to winter, Silas found himself transformed. The pain of old losses remained a part of him, but no longer defined him. Thunder's memory brought warmth rather than anguish. Martha's absence was a fact of his life, but not its central theme. And sometimes, when he rode the high ridges or worked in the fields of whispering pines, he would spot them, a black mare and a golden stallion watching from a distance. Not tame, never that, but connected by something stronger than dominance, deeper than dependency. "Do you really think they remember what you did for them?" Lucien asked him once, as they shared a sunset view of Eagle Ridge from Silas's porch. The old rancher smiled, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains where the wild herd roamed free. "Some things don't need to be said," he replied simply. "Some bonds don't need names or explanations." And far in the distance, as if in silent agreement, two familiar silhouettes appeared briefly against the skyline before vanishing once more into the gathering dusk. Wild and free, yet forever connected to the man who had twice risked everything to save them, and in doing so, had saved himself as well. My friends, we've come to the end of the story. Did you like it? What lesson can you bring to life from this story? Leave it here in the comments. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and watch this video that's playing on your screen. This story will impact you. See you next time.